glad to see you this morning. For visiting with us, especially glad to have you with us. We are studying from the book of Isaiah, chapter 54. Anyone need to borrow a book? We got two more. They are not completely necessary if you got the Bible with you. Actually, we're looking at the first 10 verses of Isaiah 54. This is lesson number 8. And then the first 13 verses of chapter 55. And as we've said a few times over the years, these studies do not cover every chapter or every verse. So I hope that in your daily Bible reading, you're spending a little time looking at the entire passage. Obviously, it's all there for a reason. God has given it to us. It all needs to be looked at and thought about. But then on the other side, in our study here, we're trying to give a general idea of it and then move on to another thought. We're on page 71. Those of you that are watching in or listening in this morning, again, we're in Isaiah chapter 54 and Isaiah chapter 55. Last week, as you looked particularly at some thoughts on the suffering servant, and we noted that as a rule that seems to apply to Jesus Christ. In fact, there's obvious thoughts that apply to Jesus. We noted a few weeks ago that sometimes, though, it seems a little bit uncertain that maybe the writer has a little bit of something else in thought or in mind. But as a rule, the suffering servant is Jesus. So I say that to say, is there anything else from last week that you didn't get to ask about or comment on? Okay, we will do as we customarily do and go to the questions. We are on page 80 for that. Maybe a little bit as just towards setting the stage for our thoughts this morning. The return of Israel, God's people from Babylonian captivity to Judah or Jerusalem is basically the subject here. You might have noted in your study that there are those that have tried to take this particular passage and find premillennialism, that type of idea from this particular chapter. But when you look at it within the context, particularly of the chapter and the book, it seems pretty obvious, at least to me, that it's completely foreign to what he's talking about here. He is talking about the return. If you remember, we've noted a few times that the first 39 chapters or so of Isaiah, he's talking about the destruction and the problems and why they're having the problems that they have because of idolatry, primarily, I guess. But then from chapter 40 to the end of the book, he begins to talk about the return. Begins to talk about the salvation, in a sense, that they were to have in being able to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. So, first part of the book, looking at, I guess, the problems and the suffering and the destruction because of sin. And although that idea is mentioned throughout these last chapters, the point that he comes to is the fact that God is going to bless them again, and they're going to be able to return to the city and to rebuild and once again, hopefully, worship God as they should. Probably as you think about this, you see that never-ending cycle of them turning away from God. They would become prosperous. They would get involved in too many worldly things, turn away from God. he would discipline them in some way. They would repent and turn back. And sadly, it was a never-ending cycle. And I think as we look at ourselves, that poses a big warning for us, I think. Obviously, as human beings, we're not always on a spiritual high. There will be things that will happen. There will be problems that will discourage us. We just want to make sure that when we're on that low, that we don't give up, that we don't quit, that we don't turn away, but that we continue to strive to be faithful day in and day out. And yet, at the same time, realize as human beings that we can get discouraged, we can get down. We're not always as zealous and as fiery and as enthusiastic as we would like to be. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, question number 1. What term did God use to describe the city of Jerusalem from chapter 54 and verse 1? Yeah, a barren. Yeah, that idea of a married woman that was barren. You know, we have a lot of examples of that. Who are some of the examples of those that were just miserable because they didn't have children?
Sarah.
Okay, Sarah, Hannah, maybe anybody else? Rachel. Yeah, several examples. We don't look at that in our society in the same way. In this particular day, it was considered a disgrace, and it was considered one of those things that would not allow a woman, a married woman, to really fulfill her purpose in life. So for Isaiah to use that term, they definitely understood that they were in a very vulnerable and a very needy situation. In that particular society, not to have children was looked down upon, and then using the idea of a widow made it even more so. And Jeremiah talks about that particularly in chapter 1, that the people were like a barren married woman and even a widow. And there was really no way of having a livelihood. There was no way really of them supporting themselves in their society and the way that it worked. So, in a sense, it was about as low as you could get. The way that they would look at it. And the idea is that this is what Babylonian captivity was going to be like. When Judah was destroyed, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, the special items in the temple, all of the vessels and the candlestick and all of those things carried away by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. That was the idea that he's getting at here, showing what a terrible situation they would find themselves in. Anybody with a thought there?
Does not the New Testament teach us the same principle when Christ cursed the fig tree because it was fruitless? It wasn't producing. So even in their day, their family name was held in extremely high regard. If you didn't produce children, that was the end of the line.
Yeah.
So even then, God not rebuked us in different ways. If we're Christians and we're not helping draw in new converts, I mean, is it not what we're supposed to reproduce?
Yeah.
So we receive condemnation.
Yeah.
If we're not out to reproduce, it's a shameful thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that's one of the beautiful things about this passage is it goes from a literal, physical material, but then he brings in the spiritual application to it. And you see that throughout these verses, that he is talking about what was actually going to happen to these people, and many of them were going to die, they were going into Babylonian captivity. But underneath that is this idea of us not producing. And not, one of the things that was very sacred in a sense to them was the family name. Was to be able to carry on. It was all tied into the inheritance in the promised land, and the families having certain portions, and then for them to have sons, particularly, to pass it on down to. There was a provision for daughters, but not so much as it was to sons. And as LaVon points out, you know, the underlying point is for us to reproduce. In fact, in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 27, Paul quotes this idea. He said, "Rejoice, O barren, ye who do not hear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband." And in the next verse he says, "Now we brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise." So he brings that idea in there and makes an application to the idea of us producing, reproducing, carrying on. So yeah, I think so. Good point. Anybody else with a thought there?
I think it's interesting that verse 1, 3 different times he insults people in general. You know, the single barren one is number 1.
Yeah.
Who do not bear, there's number 2. And we go a little further down, it says, you have not been in labor. It's really driving the point home.
Yes.
And the thing that it just occurred to me now is, with what I read earlier from here, God's anger is short-lived, and I'm thankful for that.
Yes, one of the major points of this is the mercy of God. And I think that, you know, they probably struggled seeing that. Because here he's saying that you're going to be carried away, the city's going to be destroyed, and it must have looked like the ultimate disparity. I mean, what worse could happen? And yet, as he goes on, and you finish on down here in these next few verses, he's going to basically extend the invitation, and he's going to assure them of mercy and grace. So they may have felt that God had forsaken them. I mean, what worse could happen here? But it was not the worst. Being estranged from God really was the worst. And if we make an application, you know, to us today, you know, sometimes maybe it's death, it's a cancer, it's you know, an accident, maybe it's the loss of homes, the loss of lives, and we see that sometimes as, well, you know, where's God at? Well, he's still there. They needed reassurance of that. We need reassurance of that as well. To understand that if we're right with God, all of these other things are just circumstances and conditions of this old world in which we are living. And I think that comes out here in these particular verses. Number 2, what did he instruct the inhabitants to do to their dwelling places? Make them bigger. Why? Room for more people. Okay, they're going to come back. They're going to come back. Now, before it ever happens, you know, I mean, we're looking at 70 years in bondage when it actually happens, when Nebuchadnezzar comes. But he's basically saying, go ahead and build on a couple of extra bedrooms. Because when you come back, you are going to prosper. You are going to have a greater nation, more people when you return. So he's telling them to basically make preparations now for what's going to happen. down the road. No matter what old Nebuchadnezzar does, and we know what he did in destroying everything, that was not the end. There was going to be a return. Makes you think about heaven in a way, doesn't it? I mean, something better, something even beyond our ability to completely fathom and understand. But we're going to be wealthy. The most wealthy people in the world are the people that are with God. The people that, live in such a way to have soul salvation. Jesus says, lay not up treasures upon earth, but lay them up where? Lay them up in heaven. So, the real wealth, the real riches, the real prosperity is down the road for those that are faithful. So he's bringing in that particular idea here. Number 3, what did God tell the people they would forget? Shame of their youth. Okay, reproach of widowhood. What's his point there?
Once we get through all the hardships and the good blessings come to us, we'll soon forget what it took to get there sometimes.
Yeah, exactly so. We must recognize and understand that no matter what happens in this life, it's brief and it's short in comparison to eternity. In comparison to what is ahead. We live so oriented by time. You had a schedule this morning. You got up at a particular time. We're to be here at a particular time. We expect to be out at a particular time and back. Work. You've got a time. Everything that we conceive of seemingly has something to do with time. And, so eternity just seems beyond us. But there is that idea here that, the worries, the concerns, whatever we're worrying about today, whatever is really bothering us. I was thinking a couple of days ago that there was a situation that I had thought about and prayed about, and I didn't know the circumstances, but it was really bothering me. One of those things where you sort of wake up in the middle of the night and think about it. And well, it turned out, the answer was simple, and there really was not a problem. I thought there was a problem, but there was not a problem. I suspect that happens to all of us, maybe on a consistent basis. So this is that idea of this seems terrible that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but that's not the end of the story. Yes, sir.
Now, I think also it's worth pointing out too that as we grow older, we become more mature, it should be wise, because it talks about that, says to get the same of your youth and never to approach it a little bit anymore. Says as we get older, we change and mature to the point that we remember the things we did in our youth that were not today. And as we grow older, we learn to do different things.
Well, it did I don't remember which word in the New Testament, but it talks about how that a woman quickly forgets all the labor pains she went through once
you get that new baby.
Once the child's in her arms, that's faded, almost forgotten thought to some degree.
Yeah. But if we didn't, I can't speak for you ladies, but you probably wouldn't have one. if that did not fade, but there's a lot of other things in life that way too, that, the experience, the pain and the frustrations, I know it's not a good illustration, it's like, building a house. And if you've ever built one, it destroys some marriages. That's how bad it can be. But you get that thing built, and maybe a few years later, you think, let's do another one. And the only way you're going to do that is you forget forget how terrible it was, agonizing over what to do and how to do it, how much money to spend, so forth and so on. But, yeah, I think that idea is there. I wanted to read a passage from Lamentations that fits the same idea. Jeremiah and Isaiah did not preach it at the same time. In Isaiah, it's talking about what is to come. Jeremiah lived it. He was in Jerusalem at the time that Babylon came in. And, it must have been such a terrible time as Jeremiah saw, was a witness of the destruction of the temple and the carrying away of the people. But he says in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she, who was great among the nations, the princess among the provinces, has become a slave. So he's talking here about what he is witnessing. And of course, Lamentations, it is that idea of mourning or sorrowing or crying. But there is that reassurance that he was able to give, and Isaiah particularly gave, of something that was much better. Brighter days are ahead. Number 4, what relationship does the text say God had with the people? Verse 5. Husband, well, what's that idea? I mean, what does that make you think of? He uses that idea of God as a husband. Caretaker, provider, protector. Again, we don't see this with our independence and with the women's liberation and those types of things. We don't appreciate that, I don't think, to the degree of the situation that they were in. But as we noted earlier, if you did not have a husband, if you had a husband and now is a widow, you remember the story of Ruth? And it really illustrates this idea.
Leadership is extremely important, and God has placed that, unfortunately, solely on one individual, that's the male. We have been put in that, given that responsibility by God. And how often do we, I guess you said, the term might be shirking or count it trivial? It's extremely important that the male is leading properly. And that's the greatest thing with God and Christ is that they do it with all perfection. There's no ever, that's the idea behind the faith. Well, if the wife can't have total faith in her husband's leadership, it creates problems.
Yeah, and we see that with the spiritual application here of God as the husband, the leadership, the protector. And as I was mentioning, Ruth, she was childless. She was a foreign widow. When her and her mother-in-law came home, it was considered a humiliating thing. We wouldn't think of it at all that way today, but that's the way that it was then. And she was just in a very hopeless and helpless position. And then in comes Boaz. And you remember Boaz married her, but he also became, in a sense, the redeemer. All the way back to this idea of the families and the head of the families. If Boaz and Ruth, had a child, and they did, who really did that child belong to? The dead husband, you see. So it was carrying on that particular name, that particular family line, so that it did not disappear. And that was one of the reasons, I guess, that some hesitated to do that. In fact, you remember that there was a closer kinsman than Boaz? And at first he said, yes, I'll marry her. But then when Boaz said, now wait a minute, you got to remember that if you have a child, you have a son, then he and the fellow said, well, wait a minute, second guess this. I don't want to do that. So that's how Boaz came into that position. So this idea of God as the husbandman, or the husband is also this idea of redeemer. Notice particularly what verse 5 says. For your maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and your redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. He's called the God on the whole earth. So really, truly, emphasizing that idea, and I think emphasizing God's love for his people, that even though this captivity was going to take place, God was not going to cease to be the husband. Even though it may seem that he's not giving the leadership, that he's not providing, particularly during this 70 years of slavery and bondage, he is still there. And he is going to continue to watch over them. And eventually, obviously, they're going to be able to come home. The next point, I think, makes that question 5. What did God compare the punishment in verse 9? Yeah, the days of Noah, the waters of Noah. What would that? What is that? We know the flood came. It took away everything. It cleansed, but it also ceased, didn't it? So there was a cleansing, which I think is the point. They're going to go into Babylon, and while they're there as slaves, what's going to happen? They're going to wake up. They're going to turn back to God. And it took that. In Noah's day, it took the flood of waters to more or less give a start over. Cleansing. But also, there was a limit to it. 70 years of bondage under Cyrus, after Nebuchadnezzar's gone, they're going to be able to get to come home again. And we read that in Ezra and Nehemiah particularly. But the same thing was true with the flood. Lasted a year, but finally the ground was dry again, and Noah and his family and the animals were able to come out, and the earth was cleansed. So the idea is that yes, there's going to be some terrible times, but there will be a limit, and God is going to bring the people home. That's the idea there. Number 6, what did God say the people were spending their money on? Chapter 55, verse 2. Now, we might have to sort of paraphrase it a little bit, but basically they were spending their money on that which did not really satisfy. And, that's an interesting thought there. There's a lot in the Bible about spiritual bread and water. You remember when Jesus was tempted after the 40 days of fasting in Matthew chapter 4? And Satan came and he said, just turn these stones into bread. What Jesus said? Yeah, man shall not live by bread alone, but by basically the Word of God. So I think that is the idea here. Now, if we apply that to us today, it says a lot about us as individuals when you look at what we spend our money on. And I'm going back and forth here. What do we spend our money on? Sometimes when we talk about, what we give on the Lord's Day, And what I have done, and maybe you've done something similar, is, to look at it over time. In other words, let's just use a figure. Say I'm putting $100 a week in, okay? And for that year, that'd be approximately $5,200, right? So, $5,200 for the year. Well then, in comparison, when I look at how much I make, what my income is, am I spending a whole lot more on a vacation? Am I spending a whole lot more on junk? Where's my money going? And I think it tells a lot about us. Well, in this particular situation here, he was trying to let them know that, really where your money is going, if you have $1 million, what do you want? Another million, right? And if you have $1, you want another dollar. It don't really satisfy, does it? Some of the most miserable people in the world are the people that are solely materialistic. You and I, as Christians, are the richest people in the world. Why? We've got something that really matters. We've got something that will make a difference in heaven someday. You might not have, as they say, two nickels to rub together, but I saw something that Dolly Parton had written, and it said, when growing up, we didn't have money, but we were rich. And she says we had love, we had family, we had all of those things. And she says, we were rich. Well, she's right in that statement. If you've got those things, particularly in a spiritual sense, if we're taking advantage of the love of God, if we're taking advantage of the fellowship, these are things that money can't buy. Much more important. Anybody with thoughts there?
Well, you also later, when Jeremiah talks about his attorney, he talks about the fact that they had animal homes and the house of God was going
Unprepared? Yes. Yeah.
So there again, we see things on what favors us.
Right.
And that's what they really did, even when it came back.
Yeah. And we need to look at ourselves in that same sense to see, okay, and you don't have to look at it from a money standpoint, a time standpoint, an interest. What is most important to us?
The song that was read this morning says what? Seek ye first the
Seek first.
kingdom first.
Yep.
And these things shall be added unto you. Because in the scripture that song is drawn from, tells us that God wants to do these things. He says, He goes already knows what we're talking to ask for, to seek first the kingdom of God. And that those things will be provided for us as we have a need.
Yep.
Too often we lean on ourselves to go and acquire these things, and then our money spending gets a little carried away.
Yep, it does. Well, and that's what it goes on to say. In chapter 55 and verse 3, it says, incline your ear and come to me. Hear, and your soul shall live. And I will make an everlasting covenant with you. The sure mercies of David. It goes back to David. You remember the promises that were made to David? That it would be through David, going all the way back to Abraham, working down to David. And through David's line, there was going to come the suffering servant. There was going to come Jesus. So, there are conditions. And this, I guess, is a good point for us to kind of finish up on. In verses 6 and 7, question 7, what did Isaiah instruct his audience to do? Seek the Lord, call on Him, and the wicked to forsake his ways and return to the Lord. Here are the conditions. So what you have here are the basic invitation and a challenge to these people. It's going to take this 70 years to get through their hard heads. Well, we're not any different than they are. Sometimes it takes a death. Sometimes it takes a cancer. Sometimes it takes an accident where, you know, some of the war, you know, there's more people in church doing a war. Wonder why? Well, you know, I think we all know. All of a sudden, you know, the things that really matter are in our hearts and in our lives. So it takes that. And so, seek the Lord while he may be found. Chapter 55 and verse 6. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the righteous man his thoughts. Even the righteous man needs to return to the Lord. The righteous man needs to be more righteous. He needs to be more committed and more faithful. And then, I guess one of the more known passages, beginning in verse 8 of chapter 55. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I think that, you know, the idea there is that we don't always understand. And these people, at the time, being carried away to Babylon, did not really understand how God could allow that to happen. They did not really, even in spite of Isaiah, in spite of Jeremiah, what the prophets were preaching, they couldn't see the good in that. Eventually, hopefully they did. But the same thing is true with us. You know, why do bad things happen to good people? That question will always be asked. But the Bible teaches us that if we'll be faithful, if we'll do what we ought to do and stay righteous, then things are going to work themselves out. It doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. It doesn't mean that those bad things per se are good. But if we'll learn from them, then eventually we can find good and find a deeper spirituality as a result. Anybody with a final comment there? Appreciate you today. Next week we'll be looking at God's love for the Gentiles, which is an interesting concept that likely these Jewish people really didn't conceive of. Thank you.